G'day everybody, welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm Shane Norrish. I have the privilege of leading the team here at Landcare Australia. Before we go any further, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from where we all join this webinar. I'm here on Gadigal country, north of Sydney. In today's webinar, we're privileged to have a couple of great presenters, Claire O'Rourke and Dr. Rebecca Huntley. They will be sharing some results from Climate Compass. It's a comprehensive research effort that has provided some really important insights into the public attitudes of Australians in regard to climate change. In some ways, the results are a little surprising. For example, we know that there are high levels of concern across the nation. However, it is very widespread from the cities to the regions. And the research has also uncovered what Australians believe climate action is and what they need to be doing in the future. This session is going to provide some insights that can help you inform and empower your local communities to communicate positive climate action and support people and our environment. I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes introducing our wonderful speakers. By the look of their bios here, they are very busy people. And so they've had some great accomplishments in their careers. The first of our presenters is Dr. Rebecca Huntley. Rebecca is one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends. She holds degrees in law and film studies and a PhD in gender studies. She has led research at Essential Media and Vox Populi and was a director at Ipsos Australia, which many of you would know. Rebecca now heads her own research and consultancy firm and works closely with climate and environmental NGOs, government and business on climate change strategy and communication. She's the author of numerous books, including How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, which was published last year by Murdoch. You may have caught Rebecca as a presenter on the ABC's Radio National, particularly in regard to the History Listen program and Drive on a Friday. She is a lady of many talents, is also indicated by her role on the board of the Bell Shakespeare Company and on the executive board of the New South Wales branch of the ALP. She's the chair of the advisory board of Australian Parents for Climate Action and has held other board positions on the Whitlam Institute and the Dusseldorp Forum. In combination with all that, Rebecca has been an adjunct senior lecturer at the School of Social Sciences at Uni of New South Wales, and she acts as a marriage celebrant in her spare time, as well as being the busy mother of 3 girls based in Sydney. So welcome, Rebecca. The second of our presenters is Claire O'Rourke. Claire serves as the co-director of the Australian Energy Transformation Project, a program at the Sunrise Project. She has 20 years experience in journalism, communications, and campaigning in Australia and around the world. Claire has held a number of leadership positions, including most recently at Amnesty International Australia and as National Director of community-led renewable energy advocacy organisation, Solar Citizens. Claire has a broad history of organising and campaigning in the labour movement and for organisations of social impact, including overseeing communications for Australia's successful Every Australian Counts campaign for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So before we move into the presentation, I'd just like to cover off on a couple of housekeeping matters. We'd really love to have your comments and questions throughout the session, and please provide them through the chat, but we'll have time for those at the end of the session for Rebecca and Claire to answer as many as they possibly can within the time that's allowed. To submit a comment or question, you need to be signed into Landcarer first and you can then type those comments or questions into the box underneath the webinar screen. And for that to happen, if you're watching in full screen mode, you'll need to exit to see the comments box. So with that lengthy introduction, I'd just like to hand over to Rebecca and Claire to lead us through the webinar on Climate Compass. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Great to be here. Welcome, everyone. It's so exciting to be talking to you at this time. We've got a wonderful presentation for you today. Just wanted to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Dharawal country, which is just south of Sydney, north of Wollongong in the lovely northern Illawarra, which is now known almost nostalgically these days as the Coal Coast. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging on this very special country that we live and work and play on, and also pay my respects to any First Nations folks who are on the webinar today. And before we get going, I just thought we'd acknowledge, if you go to the next slide, thanks, Alexi, that it's been a big year and Christmas is coming, and it's been an interesting time for us to, emerge from, in many parts of Australia, lockdowns and restrictions, and now we're socialising again and we're getting together with friends and family. But sometimes, if you flick to the next slide, some of our conversations can sometimes go the other way when we're talking about climate change. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk you through, how you can avoid having your Christmas dinner turn into this if you bring up the subject of climate change, and also learn a little bit along the way. So just to walk you through what we're going to talk about today, if we go to the next slide, thanks, Alexi. We're going to really give you a briefing on Climate Compass and what Australians are thinking about climate change. We're going to talk about also what Australians are doing about climate change, what climate action they're taking and what action they're prepared to take. And then also how you can have that discussion about climate change at any event or any interaction that you're having. Climate Compass is designed to help organisations and individuals, navigate those types of conversations, because climate change has become a pretty sticky issue and a pretty politically riven issue over the last 15 years. And if we're going to get to where we need to be in terms of our emissions and the kind of changes we need to make to our economy, we really need to get past all of that and find really high quality connections with people. So if we go to the next slide, we just say a little bit about who we are. I think, thank you, Shane, for a brilliant introduction and for having us here today. But there's me and my family in front of a bunch of solar panels a few years ago. I'm the mum of a couple of teenagers. I've worked a lot in comms and research and campaigning and organising. It feels like a bit of a black box if it's something that you've never been up to close. But basically, I help organisations and individuals have more impact through the advocacy work that they do to get better policies and better outcomes from companies. How about you, Rebecca? Would you like to introduce yourself?
No, that's just me looking tired. My children are a lot bigger now, a lot more grown up. And Shane gave you a really fulsome description of what I do. But in particular, I work very closely with Sunrise and Claire on the Climate Compass project, including a lot of qualitative research coming off the back of the Climate Compass framework for organisations, everything from the Australian Museum to the Clean Energy Council to the climate movement.
Thanks, Rebecca. We'll just head on to the next slide and talk a little bit about who the Sunrise Project is. We don't have a really big public profile, but we're driven by the imperative of climate justice. It's very important to us that, we see really brilliant outcomes for all Australians and folks around the world when it comes to, transitioning our economy to a climate positive one. But we work very specifically around fossil fuels, and I co-direct the Australia Energy Transformation Program, and that's designed to get Australia well beyond 100% renewables as quickly as possible, but while also ensuring that there's justice, choice and control for communities who will be affected by fossil fuels leaving the system, but also those renewables coming in. So Sunrise works in the background. We're a charity and a not-for-profit organisation. We do strategy and analysis. We do a whole bunch of connecting and convening work to help folks work together across the climate movement and beyond. And then we also do strategic grant making, and we're funded by philanthropy. So that's just a little bit about us. And also thanks to everyone who's completed the polling questions in the lead up to today's conversation. So I thought we'd just take a bit of time to go through and report back the results of that. And so the questions that we asked you were actually the questions that we asked people that determined the groups that the Climate Compass boils down to. So the first question, which is on the next slide, is how would you describe your level of concern about climate change? And what's really brilliant is to see that there is an extremely big level of concern around climate change from this group. So we'd love to hear any comments or reflections on that from you in the chat. But you're probably, this group is the most engaged on one of the most engaged on climate change that we've met with outside of the climate movement when we've been talking about this research. If you'd like to go to the next slide, thanks. Thank you. So in terms of how important it is to you personally, it's also super important. And I think you'll find that sometimes you'll be in situations where you're trying to communicate to folks who may not share that same level of importance, which can be really challenging and confronting to deal with sometimes. And then in terms of how much you think people think climate change will harm future generations of people, again, I think you're reading the science, and the science determines that it will actually affect us a great deal. And it's brilliant to see that folks here today are engaged with that. So we're going to move on to some of the broader findings from Climate Compass, a study that was conducted in July 2020, but really at the height of the first wave of the pandemic in Australia. And also we'll talk about some broad results, but then also talk about the Climate Compass segmentation study in more detail. So I'll hand to Rebecca for that.
Thanks. Next slide, please. So what do Australians think about climate change? Next slide. So about 1 in 5 Australians are concerned about climate change. So that includes people who are extremely concerned and moderately concerned. So a little bit like, the question that you all just answered, or most of you answered in terms of extreme concern. So, you may well have seen lots of surveys that talk about high levels of concern. It's important. We always want to make sure that concern doesn't get less. And so it shows that if you are concerned about climate change, you're in the vast majority. But as we know, just being worried about something is the start, not the end. We have to think about what are people prepared to do, and a lot of the compass is focused on that. Next slide. So this is really important. There's a really small percentage of the community could really be described as climate deniers. And you'll see it again when we look at the broader segmentation, that's a minority of an even smaller minority of people who, for example, are dismissive of the science. So the kind of, fundamentally that means the kinds of climate deniers that we occasionally see who have a megaphone in some parts of our media and some parts of our political class don't really represent the vast majority of people. So only a really small group of people believe that the climate is not changing. And as you'll see again, there's even a larger but still quite small group that believe it's changing, but that A, we are not doing anything to make that happen, and B, that we don't really need to do anything about it. So if you are really alarmed about climate change, you're in the majority. And don't imagine that climate deniers or climate dismissives are 20 or 30% of the population just because they have very vocal advocates. Next slide. So we're really interested in what are the kinds of climate change impacts that drive concern around climate. So what are the things that people are worried about when we think about the kind of broad scope of environment and climate, and clearly bushfires are big. When we did the survey, the Black Summer fires were still in living memory, even though we were doing stuff, even though we were in the middle of COVID. Pollution and air quality, really important. Droughts, management of waste, extinction of animals and wildlife. You can see that use of coal and gas is down there, but there's still a reasonable level of concern around those two things, and climate change itself less than all of those other climate change impacts. What we find, and we're just developing our ideas around this, that sometimes climate change as a frame isn't always the best way into a conversation with people, talking about climate impacts, talking about the kinds of things we can do around those climate impacts that so climate solutions to deal with those things that also have co-benefits to the community above and beyond climate change can be really effective as well. Next slide. So in this, you kind of feel like where do people really feel that we're going to get to the pointy end, I suppose, of the serious effects of climate change. Again, you've only got a tiny percentage who feel that they'll never feel the effects, and you kind of see that kind of sweep there. But you've got about 62% that feel those serious impacts are going to happen within the next 5 years, and again, another 70% that believe that by 2030 we're really going to start to see those serious impacts. And certainly, anecdotally, in the qualitative research, while a lot of the rhetoric is around 2050, that is shifting kind of quickly. You do get people in that kind of who are broadly concerned about climate realise that the next 10 years are really the decade of opportunity and action and serious climate effects as well. So that 2030 target or kind of deadline sees at least 70% of people thinking we're going to see those effects in that time. Next slide. So just briefly, two things. I mean, certainly the bushfire season drove some increasing concern around climate, not uniformly across the community, but people who were already concerned may well have become more concerned, particularly in the aftermath of that bushfire season. The other thing that's important to note is that COVID, despite the fact that it's been, pretty serious for 2 years in Australia, it hasn't knocked off a concern around climate. It hasn't kind of made people forget about climate change. I mean, certainly people who were already concerned have become more concerned over that period of time, but other people have maintained their interest. And I have to say, from all the qualitative research I've done in the last 2 years, it was not a common thing for people to say, oh, we've just got to wait till we're over COVID before we deal with climate change or deal with, shift towards renewable energy. Perhaps that's a recognition that COVID will be with us in various forms of the Greek alphabet for some time. And so we need to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. Next slide. A few things about how people respond emotionally to climate change. This varies according to what group of people you're talking about, but uncertainty and frustration are very much the kind of top two anxieties. The more concerned you are about climate change, the more frustrated you are. The less concerned around climate change, the more uncertain you are. And that uncertainty may be around, well, is this actually going to play out the way the scientists say, or do we have longer? Or uncertain about the pace of change in relation to it and what we can and can't do. So you can kind of see, and also I think I would also say that only 19% of Australians feel helpless. That helplessness tends to be a bit, can be a bit focused in some segments rather than others. So the important thing to mention, to show there, is that people haven't given up. I mean, the biggest challenges that we face in relation to climate change is not necessarily outright denialism, because we saw that only a tiny percentage of people are climate denialists, but defeatism and delayism. And I'm happy to say that only 19% of Australians feel helpless. There are a whole range of other emotions that feel less like they've given up. Next slide. And there's a little bit of contrast between how people are feeling about climate change and COVID. We always want to see the extent to which these two big global crises that require, a whole lot of cooperation and a whole lot of, putting the public good at the forefront of decision making by government and corporations and the community play out. Next slide. 72% of Australians agree that climate change is something we need to act on now, and only 14% think it's too late to do anything about it. Let's think about that 19% of people that feel helpless, 14% of people who think it's too late to do anything. We're still talking about small numbers. We certainly don't want those numbers to get bigger. I think that when we think about people's response to climate change being around frustration, there is there is a really strong sense in the community that we have struggled to move as quickly on this as we should have. Even when I do focus groups in resource and coal seats, the common refrain is, I wish government had thought about this 15 years ago and put in the kinds of support for transition and jobs and opportunity 15 years ago when they knew this was happening. So I think that there is even more pent-up frustration in the community that we need to act on it. And I also think that there is a growing understanding that Australia doesn't sit in the safe middle around actors around climate change, but that actually we're at the back of the pack, which is not something Australians are very broadly very comfortable with. We don't always want to be absolutely at the front, but we certainly don't want to be at the back of the pack. We certainly don't want to be outliers. So there is this kind of pent-up sense of let's get our act together. And even in groups where people are pretty doubtful about climate change, they're just like, can't we just get this done? Like, can we just should we do this so that we don't have to talk about this anymore? So yeah, that kind of sense of frustration and that sense of needing to do something is really palpable across a big part of the community. Next slide. And this is a slide I like showing a lot. There is absolutely no doubt that Australians recognise that this is a complex issue, a challenging issue that requires every part of society to play a role. Do they think that they themselves or their workplace should be leading the charge more than businesses, the Australian government, other countries? No, because they realise that other countries, businesses, the Australian government have the power, have the levers, have the greater sense of responsibility. But it doesn't mean that they don't think that their local community, other Australians, themselves personally or their family, don't have a role to play. So this, to me, this is the let's throw everything, including the kitchen sink at it, because we realise that this requires a whole of community effort. It wouldn't be a surprise to me as if you had a similar question, who should be taking the lead on COVID or taking responsibility. It'd be a very similar kind of trajectory. So the kind of argument that, oh, well, people think that the only people that can do stuff about climate are China and maybe a couple of the big countries, and the Australian government and everybody else gets a leave pass is not correct. Okay. Now, so after all that discussion, a little bit of discussion around the climate compass, here it is. So you can see that it's a lovely rainbow of emojis from people who are alarmed, which is pretty much, if you are all answering the survey correctly, seems to be quite a lot of people on the call. And if you combine the alarmed and the alert, that's about 30% of the population. So these are two groups that a high level of concern around climate change, climate and environment, driving their vote, driving a lot of their decisions as consumers and citizens. They're doing a lot and there's an appetite to do more. For them, climate change is something that's affecting themselves personally in their community now. They recognise that it's an immediate and present issue that requires urgent action. And their primary response to climate change when they read about it is frustration, pent-up frustration. So I kind of see that as 1/3 of the community in a sense way. You can see that there's 7 segments, but I often kind of see it in 3 big chunks. The middle chunk as the concerned and cautious, different segments, but they're often the segments that big corporations, big political parties, governments are interested in. It's a kind of lazy to describe them as middle Australia. I don't think that's exactly right, but I think they are interesting in that they are people who perhaps need more advocacy and persuasion around the need to and our ability to move quickly on climate. So while the concerned and cautious have different levels of knowledge, information and action on climate, they're united by the fact that they don't necessarily think climate change is something that affects them now personally. They push the horizon around impacts of climate change a bit more into the future. And certainly the cautious are worried. They're kind of socially and economically more anxious than the concerned. And for them, they're really worried about, what are the costs to me, my community, the economy, the labour market if we move away from coal and gas and towards renewables too quickly. So they often need quite a lot of reassurance and confidence and case studies to say that we can do it and we are doing it and we should do it. So they need that kind of engagement. But it is important to note that neither of them are groups that, push back or have real doubts about the climate science or the need for government to do things or the fact that climate change is happening. And then we have a couple of other segments that are, different from each other, but harder to reach on climate. The disengaged is a very small segment. It's characterised very much by the fact it's kind of 70% of that segment is women with caring responsibilities, children. If you look at the way they respond to climate change, it's clear that it's not that they have, lots of different views about it as an issue, but they're disengaged from politics generally. They're generally disenfranchised. They're so busy just trying to get through the day and on low incomes with high levels of caring responsibility that they're just disengaged from politics. And in so many ways, climate change is the ultimate partisan politics issue in so many ways. So they're just disengaged from that. And then we have two groups. So combined, that's a reasonable chunk of the population, right? It's we're talking about a quarter of the population essentially there, who are either doubtful and disengaged. So for them, they're not, they're different in, like I said, the dismissives and the denialists as a part of that, just basically bored by the topic of climate change, don't think it's happening, or think it's happening, think it's a natural cycle almost completely, and just not interested in the issue and very, very sceptical about our ability to move away from coal and gas. The doubtful are probably somewhere further towards the continuum, but the good news I would say about the doubtful is that you can persuade them and win them over, not necessarily on a traditional climate change pitch, but on a practical renewables are good for people. It's nice to have, they don't cause pollution. And so a kind of very practical, pragmatic approach to climate solutions, which doesn't use a lot of the buzzwords and the language that the climate movement or the environment movement might normally use, can be very, very effective with them. I've seen it happen in groups. I'm always constantly, I'm always never surprised that when I do groups in that doubtful category in regional Australia, they've all got water tanks and solar panels and all the rest of it. So you don't really have to convince them on the return on investment for solar in their own homes. And so what that essentially means is 91% of the community are reachable on climate solutions, on the solutions to climate change, and increasingly frustrated, wanting government and a whole of society response to this issue, which they all seem we just haven't been able to move forward as quickly as people would like in terms of dealing with it as an issue in our society. One more, so another slide. I think this might be my last slide before I move to, that's a little bit more information about the audiences and their mindset, but I feel I kind of covered some of that. And the next slide. So, this is my last slide before I hand over to Claire. So the segments divide according to their concern around climate change, and there's 5 kind of golden questions that sort people pretty accurately into those different segments. You can see there that they often respond quite differently to questions like, is it going to affect you personally? Will it harm future generations? Those are just 2 of the examples of the 7 questions. And within those segments, even though they're defined by their attitude, you can also see significant skews in terms of things like where they live, how they vote, their age bracket, occasionally gender, although that can sometimes be overplayed, and a whole range of other things about how they feel, about how engaged they feel in the political issue, in politics, and how included they feel, and how effective they feel about how their efficacy, really, engagement and efficacy. So there's a lot of demographics and a lot of other broader attitudinal traits that underpin each of the segments above and beyond and connected to their attitudes to climate. I'm going to pass on to Claire now.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we've heard about what people are thinking and feeling about climate change, but we thought when we did this study, so a survey of about 2,500 Australians over the age of 16, we thought we really needed to get a sense of what people were doing about climate change, what kind of actions people are taking, because, you know, we hear advocates calling for climate action now, and we hear opponents saying no climate action is necessary at all. But we aren't observing a bit of a shift in society around consuming greener products, or, you know, being encouraged to divest their finances or take, you know, a plethora of other actions in name of, you know, supporting solutions for climate. And so we wanted to dig into that a little bit more. So I'm going to show you a couple of pretty complicated slides, but we do boil them down later on. So if we go to the next one, we were advised by our consultancy, which is 55.5, that's done about 150 of these segmentation studies, to come up with a list of every behaviour that we could possibly think of that involves you know, what we'd call climate action. And so we worked with our consultants to group them into different categories, and you'll see there's response behaviours, which are those kind of individual actions that you might take around, you know, eating more local food or going vegetarian, you know, doing those types of things that are, you know, reducing your flights or, you know, other types of travel, for example. And then there was, you know, a group around money. So looking at, you know, whether you're donating to an environmental charity, for example, or whether you're looking to switch your bank or your super. Then there was kind of an area around, you know, educating yourself, either by just watching something or, you know, consuming some form of education, or being more active in terms of what you're researching and trying to find more out about climate change. There's so many education campaigns out there, so we wanted to get a sense of how that was falling. And then we looked at kind of two different forms of advocacy, because so much of the work that Sunrise does and our, you know, colleagues and partners throughout the climate movement are really focused on. And we looked at kind of what was termed private advocacy, and, you know, more active forms of campaigning. So if you're thinking about individual actions like, you know, signing a petition or writing a letter or talking to someone individually about climate, that was kind of grouped into advocacy. And then there were these campaigning behaviours as well, which are more public, more kind of collective, you know, maybe some protest actions and things like the school strikers that we've seen, you know, take over so many of our public spaces over the last few years. And so the next graph shows, if we go to the next slide, it shows that these are the behaviours that people were prepared to take part in, but also what they're doing right now. So this graph is organised from top to bottom with the biggest level of activity in terms of what people are doing right now, down to the lowest level. And it's pretty interesting reading. We won't spend heaps of time going through every line, but, you know, you can see that lots of people are doing waste reduction and eating lots of locally sourced food and trying to reduce their energy consumption. And then the levels kind of drop down further and further in terms of, you know, right down to whether they're going to get more involved politically or, you know, writing to their MP. That's what people are doing right now. But you'll see if we go to the next slide, we've kind of organised that information in a slightly different way, because this is organised in terms of the top 10 behaviours that people were prepared to take part in that they haven't ever done before in the name of climate action. And so this is really interesting insights, because it gives some ideas of what, you know, you could talk to people about or get your local community group or your Landcare group involved in, that has more prospects of engaging people, because there's a higher level of openness to it. So like changing to a greener energy provider, which is one of the best ways an individual can make an impact on, you know, removing fossil fuels from our power system, for example, that I've got a pretty big interest in, and also making your home more energy efficient. You know, there's lots of interesting potential when you think about what people are prepared to do there in terms of their own homes. So we go to the next slide. When you look at what those numbers equate to, you know, changing your energy provider is, there's almost 5 million Australians over the age of 16 who are prepared to do that right now. And then if we keep rolling through some of these figures, it's pretty interesting when you boil down to the numbers. So if you go to the next slide, thank you, we've got more than 3 million people who are, really happy to switch their bank or their super fund. And then if we go to the next slide, we've got, almost 4 million ready to, make their home more energy efficient. And then when we get into more kind of those, advocacy behaviours, we've got almost 4 million people that are really happy to sign a petition about climate change. And we just, from folks who work on petitions all the time, like I do in my background, it's just, we really didn't feel like we could keep asking people to sign another petition, but there could be millions more people who are willing to engage with climate at that level. And we know from, behavioural economics and those social sciences that the more people start taking part in one action, they're more likely to spill over into taking other forms of action, which could be anywhere in this chart that we've been talking through so far. And the last one, which is, pretty interesting, is that there is openness from millions of people to vote for good policy on climate change, which is really important. So it's really interesting to see that there is, despite this kind of really polarised and, at times extremely toxic debate on climate, that people have still got it front of mind enough to consider that in terms of where they might, enact their democratic rights. So we've found those, behaviours are really interesting to consider in terms of how we talk about our strategies, but we're finding that the more we talk about the climate compass to corporations and company directors, and peak bodies, that they're really surprised about this level of engagement and openness. And it gives us more nuance and insight when we noticed that there was this kind of step change in behaviour and interest in climate change that happened after the horror bushfire season, the Black Summer bushfire season. So we also looked at barriers to people taking part in those actions that they're open to. And we don't have a lot of time for that in this presentation today. But suffice to say, we were quite surprised by the results there as well. We really thought that, we'd end up with these results that said that we weren't giving people enough opportunities to engage in climate action. But actually what we found is that some of the collective barriers that rated the highest was that people didn't have that kind of automatic motivation confirmation response. Like every time they took an action, they weren't automatically convinced that that was the right action to take at that time that would make the biggest difference on climate. So I think we've got an interesting comment from Glenn from Sutherland. Thanks for commenting in, Glenn, who's asking if there's any work on the understanding the percentage of people who are concerned about climate change who feel economically trapped. Did you want to talk to that, Rebecca, before we move on? Because we're about to move on to talk about climate change.
Yeah, I was responding to Glenn. I think that while the barriers in terms of economic barriers to further action didn't outrank some of the others, it's really clear that there are some segments that are more marked by concern around things like cost of living and more economically anxious. Weirdly, the alert, even though they're kind of like the alarmed in every other way, they are more worried because they tend to skew younger. They are more worried about their own economic futures, understandably so, and a bit more likely to think that Australia needs coal, oil and gas to be prosperous. So they're really, really concerned about climate, but they worry for whatever reason or think like, I'm not going to have a strong economic future unless that's there. So that exists there. It exists in the cautious, understandably. A big part of why the cautious are cautious is not because they don't believe in climate change, but they really worry about whether, so many economic transitions of the past have left them worse off rather than better off, and they're already feeling economically anxious. So conversations about change, particularly if they think that's going to affect jobs, the economy and the cost of energy, make them concerned. And then, of course, the disengaged, by the very nature of their economically precarious position, means that they almost don't feel like they have, that caring about climate change isn't going to improve their life or make their life any easier. So it does exist, across the segments, but in different ways.
Okay, so we're moving on to how we talk about climate change. So I think that's from your dice, Rebecca. You've written the book.
I have. I wrote the book on it. It was a very difficult book to write. But anyway, next slide. So like I said, the majority of people feel that climate is something we need to act on now, and only 14% think that it's too late to do anything about it. I think that one of the challenges we have is how do we break the climate silence? So sometimes action can actually be talking. I mean, talking about it is action for pretty much everybody than politicians. We want politicians to stop talking and start acting, but we want everybody else to talk about it. Because what's really clear is except for people who are, hardcore denialists on Twitter and people for whom their job and their passion is talking about climate change, for everybody else, it's a real challenge. And even in the Alarmed, I don't think we have that slide to show you, but one of the biggest barriers for the Alarmed to do more on climate change is they feel they're not good speakers and writers. So they actually want to do the topic justice, but they don't know quite how to speak out and persuade. So one of the things I always say is that just having a civil and constructive conversation with somebody about climate in your life who might never have talked about it isn't of itself a really important action. Next slide. And I think the other thing that we should, married to that and something we should continue to talk about is there's really hope to convert all but really dismissives into some level of advocacy or action or doing something. Like I said, 91% of Australians are persuadable or open to engaging with, if not climate change as a political issue, climate action as a practical measure. And of course, that's why a kind of targeted, very specific approach to audiences is important, because what's going to motivate one group to do one thing is not going to be the same to motivate the other to do another thing. But, that should make people confident that whatever organisation you're in, whatever position you have, that there are ways to talk about it. A big part is understanding, where your audience is already now and engaging them in what they feel is possible. And like Claire said, starting small and scaling up into that spillover behaviour is really important. But we should feel confident that there's hope to convert people. Because remember, go back to that statistic, that only about 14% of people think it's too late to do anything, which means that everybody else thinks there's an opportunity to do something. I said in a presentation that I just gave a couple of times that we do lots of these presentations, is that over the last couple of years in particular, the predominant question in the community is not, is climate change happening? It's, what can I do about it, which is going to have impact and going to be scalable quickly? And these are very practical questions. Give me something to do and tell me what it is. Not everything, not a million things. We can't all change our lives overnight. But tell me what I might be able to do and explain to me the impact and the scalability of that action. And that's been a really important and significant shift. Next slide. So while most believe they should be doing more, the alarmed and concerned audiences are most primed for action. So this is the thing that's interesting. Both of those two groups, which are already doing more than everybody else, because of where they sit, they're open to doing more. So there isn't a kind of I've done, the more concerned you are, the less likely you are to think, I've done my bit. So that's why building that concern is as important as building the action, because concern and action come together. One more slide. I think that's it. We've got one more slide. Oh, and look, that's very small. You probably can't see that. But when we did this research and this came out, I realised that we had actually really nailed the persona of all these different segments. Different audiences have different barriers to action, which again reinforces the importance of understanding who you're talking to and what you want to get them to do, because their barriers will be different. And sometimes their barriers will be different depending on what you're asking them to do. Going back to that point I made before about the alarmed and about the importance of breaking the climate silence, you can see that a big thing about the alarmed is actually just giving them the tools to communicate effectively and have those conversations with people that are not like them. And you can also see that the dismissives, probably not, it's quite small, is they don't seem to be that concerned that they're not good at speaking and talking. And that they're certainly not concerned that they don't know enough about the issue. But yeah, so importance of understanding specific barriers for specific audiences is critical. And then next slide. So we have, just quickly, we actually have, we worked closely with a fantastic organisation called Climate for Change. Sorry, what is it? I always forget.
Climate for Change.
Climate for Change. So they're a terrific, almost like it's like crowdsourcing climate conversations. It's like taking a Tupperware model, getting friends around and having a conversation about climate change, taking them through that process and leading them to action. They, off the back of understanding the compass, put together a fantastic discussion guide. How do you really understand who you're talking to? You kind of like, I wouldn't want to say categorize them, but you get a sense of where people are coming from, what are their barriers, what are their concerns, and then how do you have an effective conversation knowing that that's what they're like? So that's a guide that can be used. The link is there up in the bottom of the screen if you want to have a look, and that's a little bit of content from that. Next slide. I think that's actually so just briefly, and particularly for you in terms of Landcare, we asked about messengers. Who do people want to hear about from climate? This is something we're continuing to look at more and more. You can kind of see that farmers are up there, somewhere between the more important than firefighters, slightly less important than David Attenborough, but like almost nobody's less. Very few people are more important than David Attenborough when it comes to this. We've got to get more David Attenboroughs in the world. I think that Landcare and the people that work for Landcare, and having done just recently the project interviewing young people involved in Landcare as well, I think you have a unique opportunity because you've been around for a long time, you've got a lot of integrity, a lot of trust, and there's this sense that you are connected to the land, like farmers, and for caring for it in a way that other people aren't. You've got a real opportunity as trusted messengers to either talk to the alarmed in terms of their concern, but also to other people who aren't like that and want kind of very practical, tangible actions on climate. And you are also bearing witness to the changes to the climate now. You've got an opportunity to be able to say, I've noticed, and my community is, and Landcare has noticed these changes happening, and they aren't just kind of the normal natural changes that are expected. And you can find, I think you've got an extraordinary opportunity to tell really powerful stories around climate that can't be easily dismissed, and do what we need to do, which is bring that horizon of impact of climate closer to people rather than, it's something that's going to, I should worry about in 10, 20 years' time. I think, is that it?
Cool. I might hop in here just to wrap up. We've got, as Rebecca mentioned, the conversation guide is just on the next slide here, so you can get a sense of what it looks like if you'd like to go and download it. The Climate for Change are really experts in how to have really productive conversations that don't shy away from the challenge of climate change, but allow people to connect with a facilitated conversation. So if you ever wanted to gather your people around and have a conversation because you're not quite convinced they're feeling quite the same way about what's required, then we'd really recommend that. But also I think one of the key takeouts from all of this research is that if you've got, your Uncle Bill or something around the Christmas dinner table who absolutely is a climate denier, save your energy, because, we will get more traction by having those transformational conversations with people who are open or interested, curious and cautious, and then more concerned as well, rather than trying to beat our head against a brick wall with people who just are locked out of the issue. They'll come eventually, but, we can make really huge gains by engaging with people. So I hope you've had a great time listening to this research. Obviously, it's a body of work that's much huger, and we could talk about it for hours and hours. Indeed, we have talked about it for hours and hours, haven't we, Rebecca? But yeah, we're hoping that if you just go to the next slide, that you'll have an excellent Christmas dinner. And if you do have a climate conversation, that it will be productive, open, supportive, and also drive people to some really, impactful things they can do in their own lives.
Wonderful, Claire and Rebecca. That was an extremely comprehensive overview of a massive amount of work. I suspect that there is a huge amount of further information yet to be shared within that body of work, and so I very much appreciate what you've shared with us today. That was excellent. We've got a few questions, and thanks very much for those who have sent them through. I'd just like to remind anybody who would like to submit a question, if you want to, please, you need to be signed into Landcarer first, and then you can type your questions into the box underneath the webinar screen. And just want to remind you, of course, that if you're watching in full screen mode, you'll need to exit to see that comments box. Look, I just have myself a bit of a query come comment first up, and that's in relation to the conversation guide. And I can see that that'd be a really valuable resource to assist constructive conversations. But I'm wondering also whether it couldn't be a resource for assisting organisations to tailor some of their comms for a climate change component element, and have it more effectively engaging people for action on climate change as well. I'm seeing nods, so it seems that's okay.
No. You're absolutely right. And I've used, the conversation guide is very much kind of designed to be, for grassroots or smaller organisations, or, doing this work to kind of hand it over as a kind of user-friendly way. But the fundamental principles are principles and the content that I've used to develop language guides and narratives for large organisations, like ACOS. I've worked, with the ACTU, and kind of just thinking about their internal, how they talk about it internally to staff, how they help staff understand how they talk about it externally to their members and stakeholders. The principles are very similar. Obviously some organisations are talking to people who are more likely to fit in that part of the compass. But if you're a big bank, for example, and that has made some commitments around, net zero and sustainability, then you do have to think about how do we talk about the spectrum of people internally and externally. And just recently I finished a project with a local council in Victoria where we used a version of the Climate Compass to survey all their internal staff to understand where their staff sat, not only how their staff felt about climate change, but what they thought the role of the council was in climate, and what they thought their particular role within the council was in relation to climate. They're using that work to build two things. First of all, an internal training and engagement for different people who sit in different parts of the compass, as well as it's being taken on by their communications team to guide internal and external comms on climate. So you're exactly right.
Wonderful. I like that. That just underpins the fact that it's a pretty comprehensive resource for everybody to use for different purposes. So that's great. Thank you. Just a question from Alex in the chat, and that was actually, it's quite an interesting conversation because it really raises the issue about the value of having conversations about individual action, as you pointed out, the importance as an example, waste reduction, recycling. Obviously they're important, but should the focus be on political action rather than those type of conversation, given that we really want to aim at systemic change? It feels like a larger issue than can be solved by sorting out plastics and others.
It's frustrating, isn't it? If you really care about climate change and you're in your kitchen washing and drying your plastic bags, and I am doing this every day and trying to convince my teenagers to do it too, how does that connect to the kind of scale of the problem and the kind of pace of change that's really required? So absolutely hear you. That's really, really challenging to grapple with that. But, systemic change is kind of really thinking about bang for buck actions, right? So if you think about, yes, I'm always going to be the person that says systemic change is enormously important, because you can have, reasonably small interventions or changes in terms of policy and funding and rule changes and regulations that end up having enormous ongoing impacts. I think the renewable energy target, which was conceived by the Howard government and then extended and consolidated with other policies in that area by federal Labor, has been an enduring example of how it created transformational change in the energy sector, which is seeing us now at about 30% renewable electricity generation in this country, which is remarkable, and largely driven by millions of solar panels on rooftops that also benefited from the renewable energy target. So systemic change is obviously super important, but when it comes to people who are not sure what they can do and they're asking for your advice, getting people to engage in anything is useful, because if they're getting engaged, then they are kind of thinking about they're doing something, but it could lead to something else with that spillover effect that we talked about before. And I think also getting people a little bit exposed to the science can be helpful, because then people can sometimes engage in the scale of the challenge. But also one thing that we learn in campaigning school, if there's a school for it, is to talk about, I don't know if there's a school for it, there should be lots of schools for it, but when you've got to get people to face the problem, but then also give them some hopeful news on what is possible through some of the systemic change that's already happened. We've got billions of examples of wonderful social change that's occurred because people have gotten together and done something about an issue. But particularly on climate, there's lots of reasons to feel hopeful. And so telling that hope story and kind of telling the stories of your own experience taking actions is really useful as well, because having the social proof of people in your own networks doing things almost provides a door that can be easily opened by people in your relationships and in your communities.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Claire. Look, just on your point around any action is a good action, like anything is that you get involved with and undertake has got to be a positive. I'm just reminded of one of the pieces of information, one of the bits of data that you presented around issues or an absence of motivation confirmation. And I guess I'd summarize that as a question on, is what I'm doing or what I'm proposing to do the right action?
Yeah.
And I just can't help but think that the presentation clearly showed that there is a massively deep and broad base of support and desire to take action. And I'm assuming that as we move closer to the likes of 2030, I mean, anywhere as we progress in the future, we want to be more confident that our actions are going to be the right actions and are going to be, let's call it, as high impact as possible, I suppose. It's very clear in your data that you've segmented quite a important range of audiences and different drivers, I suppose, within those audiences. For people who are wanting to make sure that they have the right action for their own circumstances, their own personal desires, do you have any thoughts, insights on how they can get guidance or how they can get confirmation that what they're proposing to do or where they can go to get confidence for those actions to be of high impact?
It's a really good point. Do you want to take that one, Claire?
Well, it's interesting because there's a couple of things that are kind of holding a little bit of tension, right? So we know that, people need to feel like they can automatically make a huge difference, because everything we're sold these days, you can buy it instantly online. You can say, well, that weighted blanket that's being, remarketed to me on Instagram 5,000 times, well, by now I've been beaten down to the point where now I'm going to buy it. That's the kind of world that we're living in, instant, impact from actions. So that's why I do actually think that people taking part in any action that they feel is making a difference is useful. But also if it's situated within a context of, potentially taking part in more transformational actions down the track. So, I wouldn't feel defeated if all the folks around you are only recycling, but the more stories you might tell them about how much solar has saved them money, or how much you care about your children and how you're emotionally engaged with climate change, that's when I've certainly observed people in my own network starting to take more actions. But, when it comes to systemic change, and people are probably It's one of the more awkward actions you can take, but it has a huge impact. It's going to visit your MP. Your MP, when they get a visit from someone in their communities, when they get lots of them, it really makes a huge difference. It's just one of those things where people feel like they need to be an expert in a policy area to go and talk to your MP. It's couldn't be further from the truth. Just talking to someone about climate change that's an MP is the same as talking to your auntie or your cousin or the person down at the local shop. Exactly. If they've got a level of concern and they're not a climate denier, it's worth having the conversation, and you don't need a degree to do it.
And if you don't want to do it on your own, it's more important to bring 5 or 6 of your friends from, the local tennis club or the local PNC. Landcare is a perfect example. People that run a community garden, or sometimes that, it's the unsurprising community voices. And having worked, Claire and I have both worked in and around politics, and I can't tell you how many MPs say to me, people say they care about climate change in surveys, but nobody comes to see me and talk to me about it. Right. So, like I said, if you feel uncomfortable going and talking on your own, it's more impactful. You don't need to bring 50 people. Sometimes you just need to bring 5. And if you don't look like kind of the usual environmental suspects, they will take a meeting with you. They will listen to you. If you find a way to tailor the message in a way that connects climate change to the things that matter to you, then it can be hugely impactful. So through my work with Sunrise, I've had the privilege of working with all kinds of organisations like Surfers for Climate and Veterinarians for Climate and Nurses for Climate and sports people for climate, that are all finding ways to connect the things that they do, the things that they love, and the places that they love to climate. And these are really effective voices and can cut through to members of parliament in a way that it finds that they might want to ignore them, but it's quite hard for them really to ignore them and not to meet with you.
Sure, that's a really good point, and thank you very much for that. We're at the end of our session. It's just after 4 o'clock. I'd like to thank you very deeply for the time and the effort that you've put into the presentation. It was extremely valuable for me personally, and I'm sure that everybody who joined in has taken an enormous amount of information away. So during the presentation, there were some directions for people to get further information. So if anybody would like any additional information, I'm sure that that can be obtained from ourselves that contact us here at Landcare Australia, or yourselves at the Sunrise Project, or just do a search on Climate Compass, I guess, and that should give you the directions to the information a lot of the information that was presented. So very much appreciate your time, and thank you for sharing it with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Bye.